Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is another lecture in a series on the history of lesbians and gays in the United States, which is part of a course that I'm giving, History 156, American Sexualities. And this is the fifth in the series of lectures on lesbian and gay men. And this one is about lesbians and gay men in the Second World War. A lot of what I'm saying, by the way, is based on this book, Alan Bay, Coming Out Under Fire, which was published in 1990. And as I was reviewing this book, putting together the notes for the lecture, I was thinking about how when I first graduated from college in 1977, there was practically nothing about lesbian and gay history in the United States, or really anywhere. One of the very first important books that had been published was a book called Gay American History, and it came out in 1976, which was the year after I came out. And it was a collection of documents. Jonathan Katz, by the way, was not a professional historian. He had pulled together a bunch of really, really interesting documents from various sources and put them in a big, thick book. This was, by the way, the first time I ever saw that letter that Alexander Hamilton wrote to John Lawrence that we looked at the beginning of the semester. And at the time, in the 1970s and 1980s, professional historians did not write about gay history because it was a career killer. You could not write your dissertation on lesbian and gay topics and expect to get hired at a university. Alan was a man who did not have a professional background as a historian. He was living in San Francisco. A friend of his gave him a big box of letters that had been pretty much accidentally saved from World War II that gay men had written to each other. And he decided this would be a fascinating subject for a book. So he went around the country giving slide presentations about what he'd found. And as a result of these over 100 presentations, veterans, gay men and lesbian who were veterans from World War II, got in touch with him and gave him a lot of information. And of course now, it's much more acceptable. I mean, here I am teaching a course on lesbian and gay history, which I never thought I would be doing back in the 1970s. But universities do not necessarily look kindly on research about gays and lesbians. In fact, it's only recently that universities have become comfortable with having gay and lesbian professors. The University of Delaware back in the 1970s fired a professor for saying in an interview with the Daily that he was gay. And as far as I know, the university has never apologized for doing that. They're just sort of hoping that nobody will remember it happened. So people who are writing lesbian and gay history are still really in the vanguard. They are pioneers, and they are working against the general mainstream of academic history. So all praise to the people who are doing it. I wish I were doing more of it. Now, to review some of the aspects of life for gay men and lesbians in the 20th century, I mentioned that in the 1920s, and probably earlier, there had been a much stronger anti-homosexual bias in the United States, and that had partly been because of growing concern among heterosexual men about their identities. They no longer felt that it was quite obvious what men were doing in the world and what women were doing in the world. Especially in the 1920s, the lines were becoming blurred, and so straight men felt that the one way they could really emphasize that they were men was to position themselves as the opposite of men who were effeminate or had feminine tendencies. There's a very interesting book written about the Spanish-American War of 1898 called Fighting for American Manhood, which, I mean, it's a modern historical book that makes it quite clear that this was a gendered war. A lot of people were pushing for the United States to get into the war because they thought that the men of America needed to be able to prove their manhood by, fighting, going to the top of San Juan Hill like Theodore Roosevelt did. So there was a general idea in the United States that fighting men in the armed forces, were masculine, and that if you were not masculine, it was not appropriate for you to be fighting in the army. Before World War II, there wasn't really a very strong sense of the homosexual as a type, as a personality type. As far as the legal situation was concerned, you were convicted not of being a homosexual, but of committing homosexual acts. And you did go to jail for that. Actually, before World War II, there were prisons in which people who had been convicted of sodomy, which was the word they used, were held in separate areas of the prison and sometimes forced to wear shirts with letters identifying them as people who had been convicted of sodomy. In one prison, they had the letter D for degenerate on the backs of their shirts. And it was made quite clear to everybody else in the prison that these were the people who were convicted for committing sodomy. And there was a great deal of hostility directed towards them, even from the other prison members. In some prisons, you couldn't put the men who had been convicted of sodomy into work groups with the other men, because they would, start fighting, and the straight men would say mean things, to say the least. So that you had to put the gay men outside the prison doing work in the yard, breaking rocks and things like that, rather than working inside the prison. Meanwhile, though, in the 1920s and 30s, there's an increasing trend among members of the medical profession to try and take the subject of homosexuality or homosexual behavior away and out of the legal field and into the medical field. Psychiatrists who were following Freud took the attitude that homosexuality was a behavior. It wasn't just a matter of people committing homosexual acts, that there were people who were homosexuals as a personality trait, and that it was an incurable personality trait. So many psychiatrists took the attitude that you shouldn't be punished for being something that you couldn't help being. This is really the beginning of the idea that there is such a thing as a lesbian or a gay person in terms of a person's identity. People who were engaging in homosexual acts and having homosexual lives were not necessarily identifying themselves as types. They were perhaps recognizing that they had lives that were different from other people's lives, but they didn't always think of themselves as part of a group. When World War II comes along, and by the way, World War II is a pivotal event, not only for the history of the world, not only for the history of the United States, but for the history of gay men and lesbians, because it was in World War II that this idea began to be formulated that there was such a thing as a homosexual man or a homosexual woman. And it wasn't just a matter of your having committed an illegal crime and being thrown into jail. At the beginning of World War II, psychologists and psychiatrists were pushing the idea that as people were inducted into the Army, and that induction took place even before Pearl Harbor, even before we had officially entered World War II, there should be a psychological screening of soldiers as they came in. First, male soldiers, and then as we go into the war and there begins to be an opportunity for women to serve in the armed forces, there's the induction of women also. But psychiatrists made the argument, which was sensible enough, that instead of having people admitted to the Army who were gay and who then committed crimes, and had to be crimes being having sex with another man, and were convicted in a court-martial and sent to prison, you'd have all of these people in prison who were using taxpayers' money, when if you stopped the thing at the beginning, and when they came in to become soldiers, you would evaluate them and say, okay, these people are homosexuals, they really shouldn't be in the Army, and turn them away, not admit them at all. And psychiatrists considered this to be an enlightened attitude. And I guess in a way it was, because they were saying you shouldn't send them to prison, you should just keep them from joining the Army. The problem was that once we were in World War II, there was such a huge number of people, men and women, coming into the armed forces that it was impossible to do any really sensible psychological evaluation of these people. I mean, as part of the induction, you might spend something like 15 minutes with a psychiatrist, but the total extent of his examination of your sexuality might be, if you were a guy, he would say, well, do you date girls? And if you say yes, then you were scot-free. There's actually a joke that was published in a paper at the time where the soldier who was being brought in was asked, do you date girls? And he said, no. And the guy said, well, why don't you date girls? And the soldier said, because my wife won't let me. So, it was, as far as keeping gay people out of the Army, it wasn't a very effective system. And there were many gay people who wanted to serve their country, and who in fact did serve their country very impressively. There are gay men and lesbians who came out of the service at the end of World War II with, all sorts of medals and awards. But they had to keep things quiet. They couldn't talk about their gayness. If it was brought to the attention of the authorities that they were gay, they would no longer usually be brought up on criminal charges, but instead they would be given what were called blue discharges, which meant that they were undesirable. They weren't being thrown out of the Army for having committed a crime. They were being thrown out of the Army for having personality traits, which, in the judgment of the armed services, made them undesirable as soldiers. Now, from the point of view of the armed services, this was preferable to giving somebody a court-martial because it was less time-consuming. It left things pretty much up to the discretion of the commanding officer. Didn't fill up the prisons with people who had been convicted of sodomy, but it was not a fair system. One of the things that happened was that because they were anxious to give gay men these undesirable discharges, they would say to the soldier, look, we want to kick you out of the Army. We can give you a blue discharge, but if you fight it, we will court-martial you. We will take you to court, and you could be thrown in prison as a result. And in any case, if you were charged with being a homosexual, you could be held in prison for months while you were awaiting discharge. If you were accused of homosexuality when you were fighting in a battleground on the other side of the world, they weren't going to ship you home right away. They were going to ship you home when it was convenient for them to do that. And in the meanwhile, you would be kept in a psychiatric prison, and you would be subjected to the same kind of humiliating discrimination by the other prisoners, some of whom were really seriously mentally ill, as you would have been in a federal prison before the war. By the way, blue discharges were also used in order to get rid of African American soldiers by racist commanders. If a soldier was not behaving in the way that the commanding officer thought a black person should behave, he could give them a blue discharge, and there wouldn't be a trial. There wouldn't be any chance for the man to defend himself. Blue discharge veterans, both the black veterans and the people who were being accused of being gays and lesbians, did not get benefits under the GI Bill when the war ended. They were supposed to. It didn't say anything in the GI Bill about their not being able to, but they were discriminated against. The agencies that were responsible for giving people their GI Bill rights just wouldn't give them to people who had blue discharges. This became such a big problem that in 1947, the blue discharge was abolished. People who had blue discharges, their discharges were exchanged for honorable discharges, except for people who had been given blue discharges on the basis of their homosexuality. These people still had blue discharges, and they still did not get their benefits under the GI Bill. Interestingly, there was this new system was felt to be kind of progressive by some psychiatrists, because instead of being thrown into jail, you were thrown out of the Army. Of course, once you were out of the Army and you applied for a job, they would ask to see your discharge papers. And the discharge papers would say that you had been discharged for homosexuality, and that would probably be the end of your getting a job, unless you were applying for a job at a place where everybody was a lot nicer about homosexuality than was typically the case in the 1940s and 1950s. Let me stop and start again here.